Greetings and salutations. Welcome to a video about audio. In this video, I am going to share my real-world experiences with the Ortofon 2M Blue Phono Cartridge. I will talk about the process of upgrading from a 2M Red to a 2M Blue, and hopefully I will answer the question, is it worth the extra expense over the 2M Red, or is it worth it to upgrade from the 2M Red to the 2M Blue stylus? First, a little bit of background. The last video I posted on this subject, we talked about the budget Phono Cartridge shootout for 2018, in which I talked about the Audio-Technica Gold Ring and Ortofon cartridges that I have been goofing around with for the last year or so. So this would be 2017, 2018, and I gave you my impressions. This is the $100 or under crowd we're talking about here. And I mentioned the Ortofon 2M Red. This is a cartridge that I have actually owned for many years, like 5 years. And in that video, I talked about it being a good sounding cartridge, but it had a little bit of distortion, especially some inner groove distortion. And I also talked about it being a sort of kind of a thumpy, loud cartridge. I attributed some of that to the 2M Blue as well. I may have to backpedal on that now that I have lived with the 2M Blue. So we'll jump into talking about that in just a moment. So after I posted this video, I decided that I was going to spend a little extra cash and I was going to get a kind of a better phono cartridge. Not to say it's not fun to listen to your records with those low-end cartridges and kind of figure out which one is the best one. Yeah, but I got kind of tired of changing the cartridges around and I want to listen to the music. I really don't want to listen to the cartridge. So I wanted a cartridge that would be closer to reference, and I use that word very loosely. We'll talk about reference at the end of the video. I want to get into that a little bit. I also wanted something I could hang my hat on, not worry about the performance of the cartridge so much, and just listen to the music and just enjoy the records. You know, that's what I'm talking about right there. I think that's what we're all looking for, right? So what I did is I looked around and I thought about it. I kind of considered an Agolka MP110. I thought maybe I'd get one of those because that is so well reviewed. And I looked at some of the other cartridges that are a little bit closer to the price range of the 2M Blue. And I decided that I would go on and get the upgrade stylus, the 2M Blue stylus, and put it on my 2M Red cartridge. I bought one of these about 5 years ago to do a video about it, and there's still a video up on the channel called What Phono Cartridge Should I Get, in which I recommend this particular cartridge. And I thought it would be fun to compare the two and see what we get when we do the upgrade and whether it's worth the money. And so that's exactly what I did. We are looking at the Ortofon 2M Blue cartridge page on the LP Gear website. I am not affiliated with LP Gear in any way other than the fact that I am a satisfied customer, and these people have taken a lot of money from me over the last few years. I find them to be a very good place to look for cartridges and styli, at least here in the United States. Currently, they are selling the 2M Blue Phono cartridge for $209.98. And they have the replacement stylus, which will upgrade your 2M Red to a 2M Blue for about $165, which is a really good price. I did a lot of comparison shopping before I put my money down on it, and I was very happy with what I got from LP Gear. I want to talk a little bit about the specifications for the Ortofon 2M Blue and what they mean, and there are some things that you need to take into account before you would jump up and buy one of these. First of all, the output is 5.5 millivolts. Now that's pretty loud for a moving magnet phono cartridge, and I have heard from a couple of people who have had problems with this cartridge overloading their phono preamp. I don't have that problem. I'm using a Scott RS30 receiver, and the phono preamp in there seems to be just fine with the high output from this cartridge. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the video. Now they say here that the output voltage at 1 kilohertz is 5.5 millivolts. Well, what they neglect to show you here is the velocity that they're talking about, because when you talk about recording to a record, it is measured in velocity of the stylus, and usually This measurement is at 5 centimeters per second. So you have a 1 kilohertz tone going to the cutting head that's cutting the master record, and that stylus is moving at 5 centimeters per second when it's moving back and forth to cut that sine wave into the lacquer. You can think of that sort of like 0 VU on a tape recorder. However, when you talk about 0 VU on a tape recorder, that means that you've already reached a certain level of saturation. Pushing the audio past 0 VU as far as your recording levels are concerned is not necessarily going to give you what you put into it. So if you did like plus 6 dB, chances are you're not going to get plus 6 back when you play it. You're going to get a very distorted plus 2 or something like that. Records, on the other hand, there really isn't a top end until you run into the mechanical limitations of being able to record into the groove, the spacing of the grooves, things like that. So it is very easy to have a record that has 30 centimeters per second velocity in the groove, and you will get a much higher output. Now, this, like I said, only will affect people who have very sensitive preamplifiers that might not necessarily be able to handle the energy that this cartridge puts out. I haven't had that problem, or at least I haven't noticed it yet, even though I have played some pretty high velocity records. I collect 45s, for instance. I have some Radio Promo 12-inch records. Those are usually recorded at plus 3 or plus 6 over 5 centimeters per second in dB. The channel balance, they say it's like 1.5 dB at 1 kilohertz. Mine's fine. I have not noticed any difference between the channels as far as level is concerned. Let's see what else in here that is useful to take a look at. They have two different frequency response curves there, but we don't see the curves, so it doesn't mean a whole lot to us. They say the frequency range is 20 to 25, and then they talk about the frequency response, which is like plus 2, minus 1 dB, is 20 to 20,000. However, we don't know where that peak is. Where is that plus 2? Is it in the high end, the low end, the middle, wherever? So it's kind of a useless number right there. And then we have some other tracking numbers. Talk a bit about the stylus here. The stylus is 0.3 by 0.7 inch, or 0.0007, 003. That's 1 mil, by the way, or 1/1000th of an inch. That is a pretty standard shape for an elliptical stylus. The main thing to look at here is the fact that we have a tracking force range of 1.6 to 2.0 grams. So the recommended tracking force is 1.8, and that's exactly where I have run mine. Also, we have a stylus which is a nude elliptical, and what that means is that the stylus is a solid diamond. It's not a little chip of diamond that's on the tip of a metal shank that's connected to the cantilever and bonded with some sort of cement. Now, that is beneficial in two ways. First of all, you do not have the mechanical connection between the actual diamond itself. That can roll back the high frequency response quite a bit. It also reduces the mass of that stylus, which means it'll track better in the groove. And I have noticed that as far as sibilance is concerned, that this cartridge exhibits very little. You have to really, really push it. You have to have a record that has a lot of energy in the high frequencies before you hear any sibilance at all. And even when it does, it's not a terrible kind of a, kind of sound. I guess it's the best way to put it. It's more like a tss. So when it does clip, it's not terribly awful to listen to. I have heard it on a couple of records that were way overmodulated by the engineer that recorded it, but most everything tracks perfectly fine. So that is one of the reasons that you're paying more. You're paying more for that bigger chunk of diamond, and also when the actual stylus is constructed, you have somebody with a microscope who is checking out for sure that it is aligned properly, whereas with the bonded styli, sometimes they kind of let that slide a little bit, and they don't have the tightest quality control on that. So that's what you're paying for, and that's the difference there. And of course, we have some other specifications there which might be useful to you. The cartridge weight is 7.2 grams. This cartridge is really medium compliance. I see it on tone arms that are probably medium mass. Although I have heard that you can run it on a low mass arm and it works fine. It works great for me on my turntable, and I'm definitely running a medium mass arm. The turntable that I'm using is an Audio-Technica LP5, which is a good all-around performer. I don't know whether it's worth the $500 price tag, but I have been relatively happy with it. And it definitely has a medium mass 10-inch long tone arm here. It seems to work quite well with the Ortofon 2 in blue. The turntable ships with an Audio-Technica AT95EX, which is specially designed for this turntable. It's sort of like an AT95E with a little bit better construction as far as the stylus is concerned, and maybe they're picking the cream of the crop for the bodies as they come off the production line. Does it sound as good as an Ortofon 2M Red? They're probably on par, except the Audio-Technica has a sweeter high end. The Ortofon 2M Blue definitely outperforms the cartridge that comes with this turntable, and even if you wire up a 2M Red, it's going to definitely outperform it. So I've been very happy with that, and I used the protractor that came with this turntable. That is another thing about the 2M Blue. You really want to make sure that your alignment is great. The 2M Red, it's kind of tolerant of alignment problems, but the 2M Blue is so much more detailed that if you have your alignment a little bit messed up, you're going to notice it. You're going to hear a difference. So if that's something that you are into and you have the ability to change, definitely look into that. If it's a turntable that you bought and it came pre-aligned, it's probably going to be all right if it's from somebody like Project or VPI, and you can just change the stylus and it'll be okay. But if you have a friend who's into this, or you have a shop somewhere, you might want to have them check it and touch it up and make sure that it's aligned properly. And with the Audio-Technica LP5 turntable, you really have to use their protractor. That's something you got to keep in mind. I've heard some people that are talking about using like the stylus gauge that you get with Techniques turntables. That'll give you a 52 millimeter overhang from the stylus tip to the washer on the head shelf. That's not proper for this. Really, for the LP5, it's like 53 or 54 millimeters, somewhere in there. So I just use the 2-point protractor that comes with the turntable, and it works out quite nice. The amplifier that I'm using right now is a 1987 Scott RS30, which is 25 watts per channel, and I bought this off of eBay when I was looking to replace my other amplifier that kind of died on me, and I got really lucky. The guy I bought it from was actually in the next town over, and instead of having to be mailed, he came and handed it to me, and it's a completely refurbished one. It was one of the best purchases I ever made off of eBay, and one of the sections that he worked on was the phono stage, which is probably why I don't have any distortion issues since he replaced all the capacitors and he modernized it. So yes, very, very happy with the sound that I'm getting. Speakers, I'm using a set of Fluence SS6 bookshelf speakers right now. I really like that kind of tight two-way speaker for close listening, which is the way I listen. My stereo's kind of in a corner, so I'm kind of sitting right in front of it. So I really don't want great big speakers. I want little speakers with good response that'll work nice in the near field, and that's what I'm using. And from what I'm hearing, it's just absolutely marvelous. I'm having such a good time listening to the 2M Blue. So to answer the question, is it worth the extra money? Absolutely. This cartridge is a chameleon. When you first start playing around with it, it can be a bit shocking because it is so transparent. You can put on one record and then you think, oh, that's kind of bassy. It's got a lot of bass in it. And then you put on another record and you hear a lot of treble in it, and you go, oh, that's kind of a lot of treble. And then after a while, what you realize is that this cartridge is not imparting a great deal of its own personality to the sound, which is exactly what you want from a high-end audio component. You want it to give you what is recorded on that record without adding to it or taking too much away. Now, there is no transducer on the planet that's perfectly flat. Speakers, microphones, phono cartridges. But this one has a really nice sound that seems to be very neutral when compared to other phono cartridges that I have played with. For instance, the Audio-Technica AT95EX, which is worth a lot less money than this particular cartridge, but is pleasant to listen to, definitely has a sound of its own. And you can hear it no matter what record you're playing, where this one is transparent. So that's what the extra $100 or $200 upfront cost is going to get you. You're going to get a cartridge that is very transparent. If you have a nice turntable and it's well set up, you're not going to hear things like intergroove distortion. The backgrounds are very quiet. There's not a lot of record noise. You don't hear a lot of pops and clicks. It does a great job at sort of bleeding those off and concentrating on the music that's in the groove. So I'm very happy with it, and this is going to be my reference cartridge for about the next year or so. Now, I mentioned that word reference, and I said at the beginning of the video that I would comment on that, and let me show you what I am referencing things to when I talk about this cartridge. And that is this right here, which is the Stanton 681, and I also have a picture of a Stanton 680EL. Way back a long time ago, 30 years ago, when I first started hanging out in radio stations, and radio stations were still playing a lot of records on the air, not only like 45s and LPs, but also a lot of the radio shows that you would hear would come in transcribed on electronic transcription discs, which is basically a kind of an LP that has a radio show on it. They're a little bit different how they're cut, but they're played back with a regular turntable and a regular stylus. Usually they're cut a little lower than your average LP, right at that 0 VU mark I talked about, or even lower than that. They're designed to be played 1 or 2 times, and then the instructions were always to destroy them when they were done. And we're talking back in the 70s and 80s, and the cartridge of choice at that time in radio stations was made by Stanton. Now, these cartridges are very interesting in that they are moving iron design cartridges. They're relatively low output. And I have 2 of them here. This is the one that I always saw in radio stations, right here. Unfortunately, Stanton they're still in business, but they do not put out the quality that they used to. So the Stanton of 30 years ago is not the Stanton of today. They went way off into the quote-unquote DJ business. They built a bunch of cheap turntables. They had the Stanton 680 series cartridges and 500 series cartridges still going, but when you bought them, I mean, the quality control wasn't there, and on top of that, the modern ones are shipped with not the world's greatest styli that are supposed to be tracked at like 3 or 4 grams. And most of us are uncomfortable tracking our records at 3 or 4 grams. I'm not uncomfortable with 3, but I'm uncomfortable with 4. When you get up there, no matter what the stylus shape is, that's getting on the edge. And a lot of these Stantons, man, you can't crank them, and you have to crank them up to 4 or 4.5 grams to get them to track right, because I played with the modern Stantons probably about 10 years ago. Of course, these days, the company is really about ready to go under. I think they have one new Phono cartridge that they have put out there, and the thing is that they were bought by Gibson, and since then they haven't really done much with them, so we don't know where Stanton's going to go. But back in the day, they were considered the highest of high fidelity, and they had this cartridge that came along sometime in the 70s or 80s. I'm not quite sure when this was introduced, but this is the 681 Triple E cartridge, which was the kind of home high fidelity cartridge. I also saw this in some radio stations that really cared about the sound, and these are just awesome cartridges. And when I was just starting to learn about high fidelity audio and engineering back in those days, back in the mid 80s, I worshiped these things. This is what I heard on the radio, and these could perform really, really well. I wish I could take you all back in time with me, and you could hear what I heard coming out of my radio speakers back in those days. And I'm talking about a good FM station with a receiver. Even the AM station sounded good back then with these cartridges. Honestly, they were just awesome, and I just worshiped them. So in my mind, these are always the reference. The 680 right here that you're looking at was the one that I actually used. Well, the first radio station I was in was the school radio station we had. The city of Chesapeake owns a radio station that operates like a real radio station, 24 hours a day, has full-time employees and everything. But then in the middle of the day, the students come and take over, and we got to learn radio. And that's what I found in the studios, just awesome cartridges to listen to. And back then, the engineers, they would come in with an oscilloscope and a test record, and they would set up the turntable. And these were really nice in-counter techniques, SPs and SP10s, SP25s with independent tone arms. We're talking about microtrack gray wood laminate tone arms, or maybe you would have like a really nice Techniques tone arm on these things. And they'd come in and set them up with an oscilloscope, and they would set the anti-skate, and they'd set the tracking force with a test record to make sure it was tracking properly, and then they would say something along the lines, if you touch that, we're going to cut your hand off, kill you, and then we'll fire you, in that order. So, you get killed first, your hand cut off or something. That's the way it really was back in those days. And boy, they did sound good. Now, the problem with all of this lovely nostalgia that I'm talking about is these days, you really can't get the good styli for these cartridges. And I have looked, believe me, because they pop up on eBay every now and again. It's always a temptation. And what I found was I bought a Stanton 681 probably about, 8 or 9 years ago now. And when I got it, I was really rather disappointed. It had high surface noise. The channels were out of balance, and it had a sibilance problem. And even though it's supposed to track at like 1.25, and I had it cranked up to 2, and I was still hearing these issues. And what it comes down to is that these cartridges, even new old stock, have sat on a shelf for 40 years, and the suspensions have sort of hardened up over time. The materials inside of them have degraded. It's just happening. That's normal time. Cartridges are perishable. Phono cartridges are. Now, I'm assuming that you can get one of these and then you could get a nice replacement stylus, but still, even the companies that sell the aftermarket replacement styli, it's the same deal. They've been sitting on the shelf for so long. Even if you dump a whole lot of money, you're not sure what you're going to get, which is really sad because, like I said, I had these in radio stations. And then a little bit later on, probably about 1988 or so, I got my hands on a Pickering XV15 cartridge, which Pickering and Stanton were kind of the same company. But think about the difference between like Chevrolet and Cadillac, okay? The Pickerings were kind of a different line, although the styli were interchangeable between the Pickering and the Stanton cartridges. We didn't know that back then. We bought a stylus for a Pickering cartridge and went on with life. And I had an XV15 which was based on this, and it was really nice. The other thing that you have to keep in mind if you go and get these old cartridges is that in those days Stanton was selling some pretty high-end preamplifiers that you would mount up under the counter in a radio station. So you'd mount your turntable in a countertop which was isolated, and then it would be sitting on foam or something like that to keep it isolated from vibration from the floor. There was a lot of effort that was put into that. And then under that cabinet, you would mount one of these preamps so that the phono wires coming out of the tone arm was only like, a foot or something like that went to the preamp. And then the audio would be run out to the console balanced from these preamps. So there's a lot of adjustment on these preamps. You could adjust the right and left channel balance. You could adjust the different resistance and capacitance depending on what cartridge you were using. These were really nice amps. So these are really low output because they're moving iron. It's like 2 to 2.5 millivolts, which is about half of what the cartridge we're talking about is. And so anyhow, you have to have all of that in place to get that super sound. I don't know how they're going to react with kind of your bone stock amplifier. Most magnetic phono cartridges that have been sold in the last 30 years, they're somewhere between 3.5 and 5 millivolts of output. So that's kind of where the preamplifiers are tuned for these days. But I did want to mention this because I've talked about this in different posts like on JC's Phono Works and stuff like that. This is my reference. I think that these were just awesome sounding cartridges in the day. And having worked with them so closely, I just love them. So even when I'm comparing what I'm talking about, these to modern cartridges, if you want to dump a little money into it, you're going to get a lot more money out. You're going to get better sound out of it than you probably get with these when they were new, because things have advanced so much further down the road. And people will go, well, back in those days, they only cost $70. $70 in 1978 money equates to about $300 today. So even if you spend $200 to $250 on an Ortofon 2 in blue, you're still getting a bargain when you work out the calculations. So anyway, gang, thank you for watching the video. I saved my little nostalgic ramble about Stanton toward the end of the video, but I had mentioned this in a post before as being my reference, so I wanted to get into that for those that had seen that and talk a little bit about it. Wouldn't it be lovely if Stanton would come back to life? I think it's very sad that Shure has gone out of the cartridge business, and if somebody would get a hold of Stanton and then bring back some of these old designs and work on them and move them forward, that would be great, because for many, many years this was the reference. So, thank you for watching the video. I certainly do appreciate it. I have no clue when the next video about audio will come along, but I will post it when something interesting pops up. That is for sure.